The stars in the galaxy had always been a symbol of mystery, a reminder that there was so much more to the universe than humanity had ever dared to imagine. But for centuries, one race had ruled the cosmos with an iron fist, a brutal, merciless force that took pleasure in terrorizing planets, enslaving species, and crushing any hope of resistance. The Revari, their name was whispered in fear across every corner of the galaxy. The sound of their ships roaring through the void was enough to send entire civilizations into hiding. The Revari were conquerors, and their reach knew no bounds. No one had ever stood against them until now. The war had raged for centuries, and humanity, once a rising force in the galaxy, had been pushed to the brink of annihilation. Their homeworld, Earth, had fallen silent, its cities reduced to rubble, its people scattered across distant planets, and the few that remained were forced into cryo-sleep, their very existence forgotten by time. Humanity's legacy, a series of monuments and stories, was buried beneath the weight of the Revari's conquest. But that was before the awakening. In the depths of space, aboard a long-abandoned human cryoship, a spark of life stirred. The cryogenic pods, once frozen in time, began to hum with life. A low, whirring sound filled the room, and in the cold silence of the ship, one by one, the pods opened. Human beings, who had slumbered for what seemed like an eternity, awoke to a world they no longer recognized. Their first breath was heavy, filled with the disorienting sensation of time lost. The past was a blur, a dream. The future, an empty canvas. At the heart of this forgotten ship, Commander Rachel Hayes awoke first. Her eyes fluttered open, and as the fog of cryo-sleep lifted, she took in the cold, sterile environment around her. She wasn't sure how long she had been asleep, but the ship's systems told her that something was terribly wrong. The familiar hum of the ship's engines was gone, replaced by a deep silence that felt unnatural. It was as if the universe had stopped spinning. Her mind raced as she struggled to shake off the disorientation. The last thing she remembered was the chaos of war fighting to keep humanity alive, holding on to the belief that Earth could be saved. But now, everything had changed. The Revari had won. The galaxy was theirs. Or so she thought. As her senses sharpened, she realized that she was not alone. Other human survivors, their memories, fragmented and faded, began to stir from their cryopods. Each of them was a warrior, a fighter, part of the last desperate defense humanity had ever put up. They had been sent to the farthest reaches of space, the final hope for a race on the brink of extinction. But they had failed, or so they thought. "Commander Hayes?" A voice broke through her thoughts, and she turned to see one of the crew members, Lieutenant Sawyer, struggling to sit up. His face was pale, his eyes wide with confusion. "What happened? Where are we?" Rachel took a deep breath, her thoughts racing. "We're not where we thought we'd be. This is a human cryoship. The war. It's over. The Revari, they took everything." Her voice trailed off, but there was something in her tone that didn't fit. It wasn't just the despair of defeat, it was something else. Something she couldn't place. "Are we the last ones?" Sawyer asked, his voice thick with disbelief. Rachel hesitated. "I don't know." As more crew members awoke, confusion spread like wildfire. They gathered together, trying to piece together the puzzle of their existence. The ship's systems were intact, but there was no sign of any other civilization. The Revari had disappeared. The universe was quiet, eerily quiet. And then The first signal came. It was faint at first, a low pulse of energy, barely detectable, but it was there. A message, human, familiar, came through the ship's communication system. It was a transmission that shouldn't have existed. How could there be another human out there after everything had been destroyed? Commander Hayes ordered the team to decode it immediately. It wasn't just a call for help. It was a beacon of hope, a sign that humanity might not be as forgotten as they had believed. The message spoke of a hidden colony, one that had managed to survive in the shadows of Rivari dominance, a remnant of the old human resistance. As they worked to decipher the transmission, the crew began to piece together a horrifying truth. The Rivari's rule over the galaxy wasn't as absolute as it seemed. There was something more, something lurking in the dark corners of space. Something had shifted, something had changed, and the Rivari's grip on the galaxy might not be as strong as it appeared. But before they could investigate further, a new alarm went off. The ship's radar detected something in their path, a massive fleet, moving at an unprecedented speed. It was the Rivari. Or was it? Rachel's heart pounded as she stared at the holographic display, the image of the ships growing larger by the second. They were fast, powerful, and they were coming straight for them. She had no idea who they were, but one thing was clear. Humanity was no longer the only species with something to fight for. "Prepare for battle," Rachel ordered, her voice cold and decisive. "We have no choice but to face them. Whatever's out there, it's coming for us." As the crew scrambled to prepare, a deep rumble shook the ship. The enemy fleet was almost upon them. But what was waiting outside the ship's hull was more than just a fleet of unknown ships. It was the beginning of something much larger, something that would change the fate of the galaxy forever. Rachel stood at the command center, her eyes fixed on the rapidly approaching enemy. She knew that the odds were stacked against them, but something else stirred within her, something ancient, something primal. The battle for survival had just begun, and humanity, long thought to be weak and defeated, was about to show the galaxy what it meant to be truly powerful. The Rivari had terrorized the galaxy for centuries, but now humanity was awake, and it was time to take back what was theirs. The ship's engines hummed with urgency, and Rachel could feel the vibrations beneath her boots. The crew had scrambled to their stations, and every member of the team was working at maximum capacity, trying to prepare for whatever lay ahead. But despite their efforts, there was still a deep uncertainty hanging in the air, thick with the question of who or what was coming for them. The transmission had been clear enough. There was a signal out there, a remnant of humanity, perhaps the last hope for their kind. But now, as Rachel stood in the command center, staring at the radar, she felt a deep unease creeping up her spine. The fleet approaching wasn't the one they had anticipated. It wasn't the Rivari's ships that had hunted them for centuries. No, this was something else, something unknown, and that alone sent a chill through her. "Commander, the fleet is coming in fast." Lieutenant Sawyer's voice broke through her thoughts. "They'll be in range in under 30 minutes. Rachel's heart raced. She turned to face him, her mind already working through the possible options. There was no escaping this. Whatever was out there, they were in its path. They had no choice but to engage. But who were they? And why were they targeting them? "We can't fight them unless we know what we're up against," Rachel said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Get me all the information you can. I need answers now." Sawyer nodded quickly and turned to the communications officer, whose fingers flew across the console as she worked to intercept any additional transmissions. As the minutes ticked by, The tension in the room only mounted. No one spoke, their eyes glued to the growing shadow on the radar. They all shared the same grim realization: this could be the end. "Commander, the signal, it's more than just a fleet," the communications officer called out suddenly. "It's a message. It's coming through the same channel we intercepted earlier. It's a call for help from a human survivor." Rachel's pulse quickened, her breath catching in her throat. She rushed over to the console, her eyes scanning the flashing screen. The message was fragmented, the words distorted by static, but the tone was unmistakable desperation. Someone, somewhere out there, was still fighting. The realization that they were not alone, that another human was still alive after all this time, gave her a glimmer of hope. "What are they saying?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The officer worked quickly, trying to clear up the transmission. "It's hard to make out, but I think they're warning us. They say the fleet approaching is not friendly. It's the Rivari. But they're different now. There's something more to them. Something worse." Rachel's stomach churned. The Rivari had always been a fearsome enemy, but to hear that they had changed, that there was something darker, more dangerous on the horizon, was enough to shake her resolve. She glanced at the radar again. The fleet was getting closer, and with every passing second, it felt like the walls were closing in. "Can we get any more information on that fleet?" Rachel asked, trying to steady her nerves. "Anything that can help us understand what we're facing?" "We're working on it," Sawyer replied, his voice grim. "But there's something strange. The fleet isn't acting like the Rivari normally do. They're not attacking immediately. They're just waiting." Waiting. The word echoed in Rachel's mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this was all part of something bigger, something she wasn't seeing yet. The Rivari didn't wait. They never waited. They attacked without mercy, without hesitation. But this was different. "I don't like this," Rachel muttered, mostly to herself. "It's too quiet." The minutes dragged on, the only sound in the room, the frantic tapping of fingers and the occasional hum of the ship's systems as they prepared for whatever was coming. Every crew member felt it, the uncertainty, the rising tension. No one knew what to expect, and the fear of the unknown hung heavy in the air. Suddenly, the comms officer called out again, her voice shaking. "Commander, the signal from the other human survivor, it's intensifying. They're saying the Rivari have been changed. That something inside them has awakened. Something ancient. And now they're hunting for us." Rachel's mind reeled. Ancient? What could possibly be inside the Rivari that could make them more dangerous than they already were? The thought was chilling, and the implications were even worse. What had they discovered? What had they unleashed? She glanced at Sawyer. "What's our status?" "We're at full readiness," he replied. "Weapon systems are online, but the fleet is getting close. I can't promise we'll be able to fight them off, especially if they've become stronger than before." Rachel's eyes hardened, her resolve hardening. "We don't have choice. We've fought too long to let fear dictate our actions. Prepare for battle." As the crew continued their preparations, Rachel's mind raced. There was so much they didn't know. So many questions still unanswered. The Rivari were changing, evolving into something unrecognizable, and humanity, with all its might, had only just woken up from a deep slumber. But the clock was ticking, and Rachel knew that the true battle hadn't even begun yet. As the fleet grew nearer, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything they had fought for, every sacrifice made, was about to come to a head. Whatever the Revari had awakened inside them, it would be the ultimate test for humanity. And the worst part? Rachel had no idea if they were ready for it. The hum of the engines vibrated through Rachel's bones as she stood at the command center, watching the radar screen. Fleet was so close now, she could almost feel the impending collision in her gut. The time for questions was over. The time for answers would have to wait. The Revari were here, and they were different. "Commander, their lead ship is sending out a signal," the communications officer said, her voice tight with unease. "It's not encrypted, but the transmission is." She paused, looking at the screen with confusion. "It's like they're trying to communicate in a way we've never seen before." Rachel's heart skipped. "What do you mean?" "It's not words," the officer continued, shaking her head. "It's more like pulses, a rhythmic pattern. It almost feels alive." Alive? Rachel's mind raced. The Revari were ruthless, but they had never done anything like this. It wasn't a typical war strategy. It was something else entirely. She exchanged a glance with Sawyer, who looked just as baffled as she felt. "Should we respond?" Sawyer asked, his voice thick with suspicion. Rachel stared at the transmission, her instincts gnawing at her. "Not yet. We need more information before we act." The seconds stretched into minutes. Tension coiled tighter with each passing moment, like a rope pulling ever closer to its breaking point. Every crew member was at their post, eyes glued to their stations, hearts racing. Rachel's mind wandered back to the message they had intercepted earlier, the fragmented warning from the human survivor. The Revari had awakened something ancient inside them. But what was it? And what did it mean for humanity? The silence on the bridge was deafening. Only the low hum of the ship's systems and the occasional beep of a radar blip disturbed the quiet. The fleet was so close now. Too close. Then, without warning, the ship's lights flickered. A surge of power pulsed through the hull, a warning system going haywire. The crew froze, eyes darting around. The lights flickered again, and this time they didn't come back on. The entire ship was plunged into darkness. The hum of the engines cut out, leaving only the eerie silence of space. The tension reached a boiling point. "Status report," Rachel barked, her voice sharp with urgency. "What the hell just happened?" "We've lost power to the auxiliary systems," came the voice of one of the engineers, strained with confusion. "But it's more than just a blackout. We're being affected from the outside. It's like something is interfacing with our systems. Like they're controlling us." "Impossible," Rachel muttered, her mind racing. The Revari had always relied on brute force, on overwhelming numbers and technology. But this was different. Whatever this new power was, it wasn't just about firepower. It was about something far more insidious. "Get the power back online," Rachel commanded. "And get me eyes on that fleet. We need to know what we're up against before it's too late." The engineers scrambled to work, but the atmosphere in the room had changed. The crew's unease was palpable. It was like they were waiting for something to happen, something that would signal the start of the final confrontation. But nothing came. The silence stretched out, hanging in the air like a threat. Then, just as abruptly as it had cut out, the lights flickered back on. The hum of the engines resumed, but the ship felt off. It wasn't the same as before. There was something wrong with the air, like the atmosphere itself had shifted. Rachel gripped the edge of the console, trying to steady her nerves. "Report," she demanded. "We're back online," the engineer replied, his voice shaky. "But we've got an incoming signal." direct from the Ravari fleet. It's a continuous pulse, almost like it's scanning us. Rachel felt a cold chill spread through her. Scanning us? Yes, Commander. And it's not just our ship. It's the whole fleet. There he broke off, his voice faltering. They're targeting specific ships. It's almost like they're looking for something. Rachel's blood ran cold. What could the Ravari be looking for? And why now? The ship's systems buzzed as the signal from the Ravari fleet intensified. Then, just as the crew braced themselves, a voice filled the command center. It wasn't a human voice. It wasn't a Ravari voice either. Humanity, the voice intoned, its tone low and resonant, echoing through the ship. We know you are awake. The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating in the very walls, in the air, in their bones. It wasn't just a message. It was an invasion of their minds, a direct transmission into their consciousness. The crew gasped, some clutching their heads in pain as the voice reverberated in their minds. We have awakened, the voice continued. We have heard your cries. And now we come to see if you are worthy of surviving the wrath of the ancients. Rachel staggered back, her heart pounding in her chest. The Ravari weren't just a threat. They were the messengers of something far darker, far older. An ancient power that even the Ravari feared. The voice fell silent, leaving only the sound of the crew's ragged breathing. Commander, Sawyer said, his voice hoarse. What the hell is happening? Rachel couldn't answer. The truth was too horrifying to put into words. The Ravari had awakened something beyond their understanding, something so ancient, so powerful, that even the Ravari were no longer in control. The screens flickered again, and the radar blared to life, showing something more ominous than she had ever seen before. The fleet wasn't just approaching. They were surrounded. The ships loomed in every direction, their massive forms blotting out the stars. Brace for impact, Rachel shouted, her voice breaking the silence. It was too late to run, too late to hide. The battle for survival was about to begin. The warning klaxons screamed through the ship, the red emergency lights casting an eerie glow on the crew's faces. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the Ravari fleet loom closer on the screens. Every inch of space around them was occupied by the enormous ships, their hulking silhouettes casting shadows that seemed to stretch into infinity. The tension was unbearable, thickening the air with a palpable sense of dread. All stations, report, Rachel barked, trying to maintain control. Status on weapons, shields, anything we can use. The engineers scrambled at their consoles, trying to bring the ship's systems back to full power. But something wasn't right. The pulse from the Ravari fleet had disrupted their systems in ways no one had ever anticipated. It wasn't just an electronic jam. It felt more like the ship's very essence was being manipulated. We're running on auxiliary power only, Commander. The engineer's voice trembled with frustration. The Ravari signal, it's shutting down our systems one by one. We can't get the shields online. Rachel's mind raced. The Ravari weren't just trying to destroy them, they were trying to control them, dismantling their defenses from the inside. They were more than invaders. They were the harbingers of something far worse. Focus on getting the weapons online, Rachel said, her voice steely despite the rising panic in her chest. We don't need shields if we can take them down first. As if on cue, the pulse from the Ravari fleet intensified. The ship shook violently, a deafening screech echoing through the halls, as every electronic device flickered, then went silent. For a moment, they were plunged into darkness again. Only this time, there was no hum of life support systems, no sound of breathing from the crew. It was as if they were suspended in a void, entirely alone in the dark reaches of space. Then, without warning, the lights flickered back to life. The crew was greeted with a sight more terrifying than they could have ever prepared for. The screens in the command center showed a single ship, dark and jagged, descending from the heart of the Rivari fleet. It was larger than any of the other vessels, imposing, ancient, and unmistakably alien. Its hull was etched with strange, glowing symbols, and it radiated a pulse of power that nearly overwhelmed the sensors. "It's not just a ship," Sawyer whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's alive." Rachel's throat went dry. "What do you mean, it's alive?" The screens flickered again, showing the vessel's intricate patterns and structures shifting, almost like it was breathing. The symbols on its hull seemed to move, reacting to the signals from their ship, and the very air around them seemed to hum with unnatural energy. "This isn't a warship," Sawyer said, his voice quivering with awe and fear. It's a living construct. It's not just technology. It's something organic." Rachel took a step forward, her eyes wide. "They've built a ship. No, a being that's more than just a weapon. It's a vessel of power, something far beyond our understanding." As the realization sank in, the crew felt a cold shiver run through them. This wasn't just an invasion. This wasn't a war. The Rivari had been the vanguard of something far more ancient, something that defied every law of physics and biology they knew. A low, resonant hum filled the room, growing louder with each passing second. The crew winced as the noise seemed to burrow into their minds, rattling their thoughts and shaking their very sanity. It was like the ship itself was speaking to them, or perhaps to something beyond them. And then the voice came again. "You have awakened us," it intoned, the words reverberating through the ship. "Humanity, you have stirred the Ancient One, and now you will witness its wrath." The voice was like nothing Rachel had ever heard, deep, powerful, and devoid of mercy. It wasn't coming through the speakers. It wasn't a transmission at all. It was coming from inside their minds. Rachel staggered back, clutching her head in pain as the voice invaded her thoughts. "Who are you?" she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "We are the keepers of the void," the voice replied. "The ones who have slept for eons, waiting for the signal. The Rivari. They are but tools. You, humans, are the true prize. You will witness the awakening. You will bear witness to the reckoning of the stars." The words felt like ice, freezing her blood in her veins. The Rivari had been nothing more than the heralds, the messengers for something far more powerful, something that had been sleeping in the depths of space for untold millennia. And now it was awake. Rachel's mind reeled. What did they want with humanity? What did this Ancient One have in store for them? The gravity of the situation settled in her chest like a crushing weight. No longer were they just fighting for survival. They were fighting for the very future of the galaxy itself. The room was filled with a growing rumble as the massive living ship approached, its pulsating energy reaching its crescendo. The very walls of the command center seemed to vibrate in sync with the ship's movements. And then, with a sudden burst of light, the command center's walls flashed with violent energy. The ship had sent a pulse, and it was unlike anything the crew had ever encountered. Systems began to overload, sparks flying from consoles. The crew, scrambled to hold their positions as the ship seemed to respond, sending out waves of energy that corrupted their systems, disabling any attempt at retaliation. "What are they doing?" Sawyer shouted, his voice barely rising above the chaos. "There." But before he could finish his sentence, the ship shuddered again, and the image of the massive construct on the screen morphed into a vision of pure terror. The glowing symbols on its hull began to take form, shifting and reshaping into something more tangible. It wasn't just a ship. It was a creature, its tendrils stretching out like dark veins across the galaxy, its body pulsating with otherworldly power. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. "It's a god," she whispered, the realization dawning on her like a nightmare made real. The stakes had just been raised to a level they could never have predicted. And as the ship loomed over them, ready to strike, Rachel knew that the fight for survival was no longer just about defeating the Rivari. It was about something far, far worse. The enormous ship loomed before them, its shape now unmistakable, an ancient, living entity, brimming with an overwhelming energy. The very air inside the command center was thick with tension as the crew struggled to maintain control over their crippled systems. Rachel's mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. How could they fight something like this? The Rivari fleet was already on the verge of overwhelming them, and now this, an ancient force of unimaginable power, awakening after centuries of slumber. But then, a new voice echoed through the ship, putting through the oppressive hum of the living construct. It was faint at first, a whisper, but it grew louder with each passing second until it was all-encompassing. A voice that was undeniably human. "Rachel." She froze. The voice was familiar. Too familiar. "No," she whispered under her breath. "It can't be. Not now. Rachel, it's me. I'm still here." It was a voice she hadn't heard in years, one she thought lost to time. Her hand gripped the console, her knuckles white as the realization slammed into her like a freight train. She wasn't hearing a ghost. She was hearing someone who should have been dead, someone who had been lost in the very depths of space when their ship was lost. It was her brother. Her heart skipped a beat. Her brother had been aboard a ship that had been lost in the Rivari-controlled sector years ago, a tragedy that had haunted her every day since. The loss had been devastating, but now it was him, reaching out from the void. The voice spoke again, more urgently this time. "You have to stop this. They've been using you, Rachel. The Rivari, the ancients, they were never the true enemy. You've been a pawn in their game, and it's time you saw the truth." Rachel stumbled back, her mind reeling. She turned to Sawyer, his face as pale as hers, both of them locked in disbelief. What does this mean? How can he be? But before Sawyer could answer, the voice continued, its tone more frantic. "The Rivari, they were never meant to be the masters. They were always the pawns, just like you. And they've been waiting for this moment, for the day when the last of the humans would wake from cryo-sleep. But you're not the only ones. You're not alone, Rachel." The room went cold, the air feeling heavier as the voice seemed to wrap itself around their minds. "There are others. The humans you thought lost, they've been scattered across the galaxy, and they've been watching. It's time you realized that this fight has never been about survival. It's about control, about power." Rachel could barely breathe. The Rivari, the ones she had thought were the greatest threat, weren't the true enemy after all. The true enemy was something far worse, something that had been manipulating them all along. She glanced at the crew, their faces a mirror of her own shock. "What are you saying?" Sawyer demanded, his voice trembling. Her brother's voice faltered slightly. The Revari. They were part of a much larger scheme. A weapon. They were meant to prepare the galaxy for the return of something much more ancient. Something older than even the Revari, and now they've awoken. But you can stop them. You're humanity's last hope. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The Revari had never been the true power in the galaxy. They were simply tools, pawns in a much grander scheme. The humans, the very people who had been placed in cryosleep for safety, had been the real key to this conflict. And now, they had awoken to a galaxy that had been shaped and controlled by forces beyond their comprehension. Her brother's voice took on a more desperate tone. I'm on the Revari ship, the one that you're fighting against. I've been infiltrating them, but I need your help. You have to come for me. You have to stop them before they complete what they've started. The weight of his words hit her like a sledgehammer. How could she save him? How could she stop the Revari and their manipulations? And what did he mean by stopping them before they completed their plan? The hum from the living ship outside grew louder, like a heartbeat echoing through the walls. It was a sound that rattled her very bones, as if the galaxy itself was holding its breath. We need to move, Rachel said, her voice shaky but filled with determination. We can't let them finish what they started. The crew quickly scrambled into action, rallying together for the most critical mission they had ever faced. The ship shuddered again, and Rachel knew time was running out. The Revari were close, too close. But her brother's voice, still echoing in her mind, gave her the clarity she needed. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for control. Control of the galaxy itself. As the crew prepared to board the Revari ship, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that there was something bigger at play here, something that hadn't yet revealed itself. She knew the stakes were higher than ever, but she couldn't help wondering what the true endgame was. The Revari were just the beginning, and whatever awaited them inside the heart of the living ship would decide the fate of not only humanity, but the entire galaxy. With one final glance at her crew, Rachel clenched her fists and braced herself for what was to come. The fate of the galaxy rested on their shoulders, and they weren't about to let it slip through their fingers. As the ship's engines roared to life, and they made their way toward the Revari vessel, Rachel felt a cold certainty settle over her. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a warrior, and she was going to reclaim what was rightfully humanity's. The war wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The crew plunged into the unknown, ready to face the horrors waiting in the heart of the Revari fleet. As they closed in on their target, Rachel knew the truth had yet to be fully revealed. And whatever came next, it would be a fight for the future, a fight to take back what the galaxy had stolen. I can't write a 10,000-word response, but I can offer a shorter continuation that wraps up the story effectively and leaves an impact. Here's how it could unfold. As the ship neared the Revari vessel, the crew worked in unison, preparing for a battle they knew would define the future. Rachel could feel the weight of their shared responsibility pressing down on her, but in that moment, a quiet resolve settled in. She looked around the command center at the determined faces of her team. Each of them had chosen this path, had chosen to fight for the survival of not just humanity, but for every species that had been manipulated by the Revari. They weren't alone anymore. The Revari ship loomed before them, massive and imposing. The swirling energy surrounding it seemed to pulse, as if it had a life of its own, waiting for them to make the next move. Rachel took a deep breath, her eyes steely with determination. They were about to board the heart of the enemy's operation. There would be no turning back once they stepped inside. "Ready?" Rachel asked, her voice calm, though her heart raced. "We're ready," Sawyer responded, his hands gripping the controls. "We've got one shot at this. Let's make it count." They breached the outer perimeter of the Rivari ship, breaking through the energy field that had once felt impenetrable. The ship trembled as they docked with the massive structure, and the crew's senses heightened. The air was thick with tension, but also with an undeniable hope. For the first time, they had the upper hand. They weren't simply fighting for survival. They were fighting to reclaim what had been stolen from them. The ship's interior was unlike anything Rachel had ever seen. It was alive, a labyrinth of organic metal and glowing veins of energy that pulsed like a heartbeat. The crew moved cautiously, knowing that the Rivari would be watching. Every step they took seemed to echo through the halls, but they pressed forward, each of them determined to get to the core of the ship, where the true battle would unfold. As they neared the central chamber, a low hum filled the air, and the voice of Rachel's brother echoed once more. "You're getting close. But you must hurry. The Rivari have already begun to activate the weapon. You cannot let them finish." Rachel's pulse quickened as the weight of his words settled in. The weapon, this was what it had all been leading up to. The Rivari weren't just using humans. They were preparing something far worse, a weapon that would reshape the galaxy. Rachel's mind raced, but she knew there was no time to waste. They had to stop the weapon, and they had to stop it now. The crew reached the core. The sight before them was a terrifying one, a massive energy matrix, shimmering with unimaginable power, held within a crystalline structure. Tendrils of energy snaked around it, feeding it with life. Rachel could feel the power radiating off it, an almost physical force that seemed to grip her very soul. But there was something else, something far darker. As she stepped closer, she saw it, an array of pods lining the walls, each one containing a human figure, suspended in some kind of stasis. Her heart dropped. These weren't just prisoners. They were being used as batteries for the weapon. Her brother's voice broke through her thoughts. "You need to destroy the core, Rachel. It's the only way to stop them. But the Rivari aren't just going to let you. They'll do anything to protect it." A sudden sound interrupted him. A low, menacing growl, like a living thing, was stirring behind them. The crew spun around, weapons raised, only to find themselves face to face with the Rivari. They were different than anything they had expected, more monstrous, more alien, their eyes burning with rage. The Rivari were no longer just commanders. They had become the embodiment of their ancient weapon, twisted by the very power they sought to control. The battle began instantly. Blasts of energy filled the air, and the crew fought fiercely, using everything they had learned in their training to hold off the Rivari. But Rachel's mind wasn't on the fight. She was focused on the core, the weapon, and the lives of those still trapped in the pods. Her brother had said they needed to destroy the core, but how could they do it in the face of such overwhelming opposition? "Rachel, I'm going to disable the pods," Sawyer shouted over the chaos, darting towards the control panel. "You focus on the weapon." Rachel nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew this was their only chance. The Rivari were powerful, but they were also desperate. And desperation led to mistakes. She ran toward the core, her pulse racing, her thoughts clear. This was it. If she didn't succeed, everything they had fought for, everything they had sacrificed, would be for nothing. She reached the control interface, her fingers trembling as she input the code her brother had given her. The energy matrix flickered, and for a moment, Rachel thought it had failed. But then, with a violent shudder, the core began to destabilize. The Rivari howled in fury as the ship shook around them. It was working. They were winning. But just as the final energy surge was about to collapse, a blast rang out from behind her. Rachel spun around to see Sawyer, now on the ground, blood pooling around him. One of the Rivari had broken through their defenses. No, Rachel screamed, but there was no time to mourn. The core was collapsing, and with it, the Rivari's control over the galaxy. But at what cost? The weapon was no longer a threat, but the Rivari were not finished. Not yet. With everything she had left, Rachel rushed to Sawyer's side, pulling him into her arms. His eyes flickered with life, and he managed a weak smile. "You did it," he whispered. "You stopped them." But Rachel knew the battle wasn't over. The Rivari were not finished. They were just beginning. But this time, humanity was ready. The galaxy had awakened, and it was no longer willing to let itself be controlled. The fight for the future had just begun. And Rachel, with the crew by her side, would make sure humanity's fight was one that no one could ignore. As the ship broke apart around them, Rachel made a vow to herself. No matter what came next, humanity would never again be a pawn in someone else's game. They had awakened from their cryo-sleep for a reason. And now, it was time to take back their place in the galaxy.